The courtroom went quiet the moment I pushed open the door. Not the polite kind of quiet that settles over a room when someone enters late. This was the kind that drops like a stone, sudden, complete, weighted with something no one quite knew how to name. I felt it before I even crossed the threshold. 30 pairs of eyes swung toward me, and for a long second, nobody moved. I was still wearing my uniform. I hadn't planned it that way. I'd landed at Fort Campbell less than 18 hours earlier, driven straight through the night from Kentucky to Tennessee, and simply hadn't had time, or maybe I hadn't wanted the time to change. The Army combat uniform was creased from the flight, but my boots were clean and my captain's bars caught the fluorescent light above the door. I'd pinned my combat patch on by feel in the rearview mirror of a gas station parking lot somewhere around 3 a.m. My brother saw me first. He was seated at the plaintiff's table with his wife beside him and their attorney at the far end. 3 people arranged like a wall. He turned at the sound of the door, and when he saw me, he laughed. Not a small sound. A real laugh. Loud enough that his attorney put a hand on his arm. My brother leaned back in his chair and shook his head slowly, the way you do when something confirms exactly what you always thought about a person. My mother was sitting in the gallery behind him. She looked at me the way she always looked at me when I wore the uniform, like I was dressed for a costume party and had chosen the wrong costume. She pressed her lips together and turned back to face the front of the room. I walked to the defendant's table and sat down next to my attorney, a woman named Patricia Okafor who had driven up from Nashville and whom I had spoken to exactly 4 times by phone before this morning. She glanced at my uniform, said nothing, and slid a yellow legal pad across the table so I could read her handwritten notes. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock. It was 8:57. I set my hands flat on the table and looked straight ahead. My grandmother's name was Dorothy Jean Calloway, and she had lived in the same white farmhouse outside of Clarksville, Tennessee for 61 years. She grew tomatoes and raised beds along the south fence and kept wind chimes on every porch post and made the best chess pie in Montgomery County, according to anyone who had ever eaten it, which was most of the county at one point or another. She died in October, 11 months after I had last seen her in person, when I was home on a brief leave between deployments. We had sat on her back porch and drunk sweet tea, and she had told me, without any particular drama, that she had updated her will and that I should know the farmhouse was mine when she went. Not split between the family. Mine. She said it the way she said most important things. Plainly, without ceremony, looking out at the tree line rather than at me. "You're the one who'll take care of it," she said. "Your brother never came back to fix the gutters. You know that? 4 years those gutters have been pulling away from the roof. I asked him twice. I hadn't known what to say. I told her I would come back and fix them myself. She patted my hand and said, 'I know you will.' She died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning while I was running a security patrol through a district outside of Kandahar. By the time the Red Cross message reached my command and I had the date and the details, she had already been buried in the church cemetery 3 miles down the road from the farmhouse, in the plot beside my grandfather. I didn't make it home for the funeral. My brother never forgave me for that, though he'd had 13 years to decide whether my absence from every other family event was worth forgiving, and had never managed it. The will was filed with the county. It was clear. Dorothy Jean Calloway left the farmhouse, the 4 acres, and the contents of the property to her granddaughter, Sarah Louise Mitchell. There were small bequests to a few people from her church, and a modest account split between the family. My brother contested it within 30 days. His argument, as explained to me by Patricia Okafor, was that our grandmother had been in cognitive decline at the time she updated her will, that she had been unduly influenced by my repeated visits, repeated being his word for the handful of weeks total I had been back in Clarksville over the previous decade, and that the property should be divided equally between her 2 grandchildren. His attorney had filed 56 pages of supporting documentation. Patricia had filed 61. The judge entered at 9 o'clock exactly. His name was the Honorable Gerald Marsh, and he was a compact man in his late 60s with the kind of posture that suggests someone spent years correcting it deliberately. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, looked at the papers in front of him, and then looked up. His eyes found me before they found anything else in the room. He looked at my uniform for a moment. Not the way my brother had looked at it. He looked at it the way someone looks at a thing they recognize but weren't expecting to see in a particular place. A careful, recalibrating look. He didn't say anything. He set his glasses on his nose and called the hearing to order. My brother's attorney went first. He was a tall man with an expensive suit and the rehearsed confidence of someone who had won a lot of hearings in rooms like this one. He laid out the argument cleanly. Dorothy Calloway had been 79. She had experienced 2 minor episodes that her primary care physician had noted in his records. She had been isolated after the death of her church friend the previous spring, and she had been, as he put it, subject to an outsized emotional influence by a granddaughter who appeared rarely but dramatically in a military capacity, in a manner calculated to impress an elderly woman with patriotic sympathies. He said this last part without looking at me, which I appreciated in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude. My mother made a small sound in the gallery. Agreement, I thought. Or maybe just acknowledgement. I didn't turn around. My brother was watching me when his attorney sat down. He had the look of a man waiting for a reaction, and I had spent 13 years learning not to give him one, so I looked at the middle distance and waited. Patricia rose and made her counter-argument efficiently and well. The will had been drafted by a licensed attorney, witnessed by 2 parties, and filed correctly. Dorothy Calloway had passed a cognitive screening administered by her physician 8 weeks before signing the updated document. There was no evidence of undue influence. The law in the state of Tennessee was clear. The judge listened to both sides without expression. Then he looked at me directly and said, "Captain Mitchell, I see you've come directly from an assignment." It wasn't quite a question. I said, "Yes, Your Honor. I landed yesterday morning." He nodded. He looked at my uniform again, and something moved behind his eyes that I couldn't read. He took off his glasses and set them carefully on the bench. "Before we continue," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to understand this isn't relevant to the legal question before me. I'm asking for personal reasons, and you're under no obligation to answer." He paused. "Are you the same Sarah Mitchell who was stationed at FOB Salerno in 2019? The room shifted. I heard my brother's chair scrape slightly against the floor. His attorney turned toward the bench with a measured expression that suggested he wasn't sure what was happening but was not pleased by it. I said, "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My son's name is Daniel Marsh. He was a staff sergeant with the 101st Airborne. He came home. He stopped. He told me about you. I didn't say anything. He told me what happened at the aid station," the judge said. "After the IED, I felt something tighten in my chest. I kept my hands flat on the table. He said there was a captain who worked on him for 40 minutes in a collapsed aid station while the all-clear hadn't been given. He said she wouldn't leave." The judge's voice was careful and even. He said he asked her once to go, and she told him she hadn't come this far to go anywhere. My brother had gone completely still. I could feel it from across the room without looking at him. "I've been looking at that uniform," the judge said, "since you walked in, trying to place why I recognized your name on the docket. I apologize for the interruption." He put his glasses back on. "This doesn't change the legal matter before us. I want to be clear about that. The law doesn't care about my personal gratitude, and it shouldn't." He looked at Patricia. "Counselor, please continue." Patricia had 3 witnesses. A neighbor who had helped Dorothy plant her garden the same spring she'd updated the will and could speak to her mental clarity, the attorney who had drafted the document, and a woman from Dorothy's church who had been present for conversations about the farmhouse going back 15 years. My brother's attorney cross-examined all 3. He was skilled at it. He found small inconsistencies and tugged at them. He suggested that an elderly woman's affection for a soldier granddaughter was not the same as sound judgment. During the 3rd cross-examination, my brother leaned over and said something quietly to his wife. She nodded. He looked at me. I looked back at him. He had 3 years on me. We had grown up in the same house, gone to the same schools, attended the same church until I stopped going the summer I turned 16 and decided that the army recruiter who visited our high school was offering something more honest than anything else available to me at the time. My brother had stayed. He'd taken over our father's landscaping business, built a nice house on the edge of town, had 2 kids I barely knew. He came to see our grandmother on her birthday and at Christmas, and he had not fixed the gutters. I did not think he was a bad person. I thought he had made a story about me that was easier than the truth, that I had left, that I had chosen something over the family, that whatever I had done out there in places with names he couldn't pronounce was less real than the life he'd built in a place where everyone knew his name. The story was easier than admitting that we had simply grown into different people who didn't know how to talk to each other across the distance. The story had been working fine for him until it walked into a courtroom in combat boots. When Patricia finished with her 3rd witness, my brother's attorney stood again. He was recalibrating. I could see it in the way he moved. Not less confident, but differently calibrated. He addressed the judge in the measured, respectful tone of a man who knows a room has shifted and is deciding how to proceed in it. "Your Honor," he said, "we have great respect for Captain Mitchell's service to this country. That isn't in question. What is in question is whether the decedent was in a position to make a sound legal decision and whether the emotional weight of that service may have, Counselor." The judge's voice was patient. "I've read the physician's report. I've read both sets of briefs. Dorothy Calloway scored a 28 out of 30 on her cognitive screening. My own mother scored a 26 at 74, and we just watched her demolish my brother-in-law at Scrabble last Sunday." He set down the document he was holding. "Proceed to your next point, please." My brother's attorney proceeded. He did his job competently and thoroughly and without much hope, I thought, though I was not an attorney and could be wrong. It went on for another hour. I sat straight and kept my hands on the table and tried not to think about anything except the grain of the wood in front of me. At one point, my mother got up from the gallery and went into the hallway. She came back 10 minutes later. I watched the door open and close in my peripheral vision and thought about the look on her face when I had walked in. Not anger. Not quite. Something more complicated than anger. The expression of a woman who had made her own story about her daughter and was being asked to hold both the story and the evidence against it at the same time. Judge Marsh ruled just before noon. The will stand. Dorothy Jean Calloway had been of sound mind and body when she updated her estate documents. The evidence offered by the plaintiff did not meet the legal standard for undue influence. The farmhouse and the property belonged to Sarah Louise Mitchell, effective immediately, with all associated legal costs to be borne by the plaintiff per the court's discretion. He said it plainly and without drama, and closed the folder in front of him. My brother sat very still for a moment. His wife put her hand on his arm. His attorney was already gathering documents. I watched my brother's jaw work, like he was deciding whether to say something, and then he stood up and straightened his jacket and walked out of the courtroom without looking at me. His wife followed him. Their attorney followed them. The gallery was nearly empty. My mother was the last one there. I turned around. She was still sitting in her row, her purse on her lap, her hands folded over the clasp the way she always held it in church. She looked smaller than I remembered. She always looked smaller than I remembered, and every time I came home I was surprised by it again. She looked at me for a long moment. The courtroom was mostly empty now. Patricia was putting papers away beside me, not listening or pretending not to. My mother said, "You could have called before you landed." "I know," I said. "I would have picked you up from the airport. I had a rental car." She nodded. She looked at the space just to the left of my face, the way she did when she was deciding something. "Your grandmother always said you were the stubborn one," she said finally. She meant it as a compliment. I was never sure she was wrong. She stood up and smoothed her skirt and walked out. I watched her go. Patricia handed me a copy of the judge's order without comment and clicked her briefcase shut and told me she'd send the final documentation by the end of the week. I thanked her. She shook my hand and left. I stood alone in the empty courtroom for a minute, maybe two. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone had left a paper coffee cup on one of the gallery benches. The American flag behind the bench was slightly crooked, tilted a few degrees to the left. I walked over and straightened it. Old habit. Then I walked out. In the parking lot, a man was waiting by a pickup truck 2 spaces from my rental car. He was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, with the particular stillness of someone who learned to wait without fidgeting. He was in civilian clothes but held himself like he wasn't. I recognized him before I recognized his face. You learn something about a person when you spend 40 minutes keeping them alive in a collapsed building with the dust still settling and the radio full of static. You learn the sound of their breathing, the way they hold on to consciousness, the specific quality of their particular stubbornness. Staff Sergeant Daniel Marsh had been very stubborn. I'd appreciated that about him at the time. He was standing by the truck with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at me the way people look when they've been waiting to say something and aren't sure how it's going to land. I stopped in front of him and said, "Your father didn't tell me you were here." "He didn't know," Daniel said. "I drove up this morning when I saw the docket online. I didn't want to." He stopped. "I wanted to see how it went." "It went fine." "Yeah." He nodded. I heard. He shifted his weight. "My dad wasn't supposed to say anything in there. I told him it wasn't. He wasn't supposed to. He was clear about it not changing the outcome." Still, Daniel looked at my uniform, then back at my face. "He's been looking for a way to say thank you for 6 years. He's a judge. He doesn't really have other tools." I looked at him. His left shoulder still sat lower than his right, a permanent reminder of the rebar that had torn through it. He moved without a limp, which I was glad to see. Last time I'd gotten any news, through the kind of indirect military network grapevine that veterans rely on, he'd been in his 3rd surgery. "How's the shoulder?" I asked. "Physical therapy says I'm at about 90%. He almost smiled. "Army said 75 and medically separated me, so..." He shrugged the good shoulder. "I'm out." "What are you doing now?" "Working for a construction company in Nashville. Project management." He paused. "It's fine." "It's not." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I knew the end of it. It's not the same. Nothing is the same. You find a way to be okay with that, or you don't, and the ones who do are usually the ones who find something worth getting up for in the morning that isn't the mission. "It's fine," he said again, more firmly. We stood there in the parking lot for a moment. The sun was almost directly overhead, and it was warm for November, the kind of Tennessee warm that apologizes for itself a little, like it knows winter is coming and is trying to make up for it in advance. "There's a diner about a mile from here," he said. "My dad said you used to live in this county." "My grandmother did. He said they have good pie." "They do," I said. "Chess pie, usually on Thursdays." He looked at me. "Is it Thursday?" "It is," I said. He half smiled. "Well," he said. "Yeah," I said. I unlocked my rental car and he got in his truck and we drove separately to the diner, which is the kind of thing that happens when 2 people have been trained for 3 years not to need anyone to navigate for them. I ate chess pie and he had coffee and we talked for 2 hours. Not about the aid station, not about the hearing. We talked about the kind of things people talk about when they've been in the same particular darkness and come out the other side. Small things, specific things. The kind of details that prove to both parties that a normal life is still available. His niece had just started kindergarten. I had a dog at a friend's house in Clarksville who I had not seen in 8 months. He was reading a book about the history of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which he said was more interesting than it sounded. I told him I'd take his word for it. When we were done, he left a 20 on the table and we walked out to the parking lot together. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked. "I'm going to go fix some gutters," I said. He nodded like that was the most sensible answer he'd heard all day. I drove out of Clarksville on the old highway, not the interstate. Past the church where my grandmother was buried, past the feed store that had been there since before I was born, past the gas station where I'd bought orange juice at 3 in the morning on my way in. The road ran flat through open farmland and then began to rise gently as it moved north. The kind of rise you barely notice until you look back and see how far below you the town sits. The farmhouse came into view from the road, just as it always had. White paint, tin roof, the front porch facing southwest to catch the afternoon light. The wind chimes were still there. I could hear them from the car when I pulled into the gravel drive. A faint, irregular music. The sound of my grandmother's house remembering itself. I sat in the car for a moment. The gutters on the south side were visibly pulling away from the fascia board, 15 feet, maybe 20 of separation. A winter project, probably. New brackets, new sealant, maybe a section of replacement gutter along the corner where the old one had bent. I ran the list in my head automatically, the same way I'd been trained to assess, prioritize, triage, start with the most critical, work outward from there. I got out of the car, the yard was overgrown and the garden beds were empty and the swing on the back porch hung at an angle where one chain had stretched. None of it was unfixable. All of it was mine. I walked to the back porch and stood there looking at the tree line that my grandmother had looked at for 61 years. The light was starting to go orange in the west. The wind chimes talked to each other in the breeze. Somewhere in the field beyond the fence, something moved through the tall grass, a deer maybe, or just the wind finding a path through. My phone buzzed. A text from Patricia, paperwork processing confirmed. Keys to be formally transferred by Friday. Anything else you need, don't hesitate. I put the phone back in my pocket. There was a hardware store in town that closed at 6. I had maybe 40 minutes. I thought about gutters, about brackets, about what grade of sealant held best through a Tennessee winter. I thought about my grandmother's hands in the garden, her voice telling me plainly that I was the one who would come back and take care of it, the way she said true things, without ceremony, without needing them to be more than what they were. I thought about my brother walking out of the courtroom without looking at me, and I hoped, quietly and without much expectation, that someday the story he'd been telling himself would get tired of its own weight. People's stories did that, sometimes. They got heavy enough that it became easier to put them down than to keep carrying them. I knew something about that. I thought about my mother saying I would have picked you up from the airport in the way she'd smoothed her skirt before she left, the habit of a woman composing herself before walking back into the world. I had her hands. I'd noticed it for the first time when I was in the aid station, working, and had looked at my own hands and thought, those are her hands. It had seemed important at the time. Maybe it still was. The swing creaked in the breeze. I put my hand on the chain, tested its tension, thought about what hardware I'd need to level it back out. It was the kind of problem that looked bigger than it was. Most things were. I had a dog to pick up, a roof to inspect, 61 years of wind chime music to account for. I had work to do. I went to get started.